Years ago, Jeanette and I visited some friends. Yes, I have a cold. You can hear it. I can hear it. Let's just close in prayer. No, I feel fine. I just can hear my voice. Jeanette and I visited some friends who had moved to another city, new house, all that. And we stayed down there. And the first night, middle of the night, we woke up in this startled daze of panic. The noise of this train, freight train, in the backyard. I mean, literally at the end of the backyard wasn't that big. The sound of the horn, the sound of the motor, the sound of the tracks, the wheels hitting the tracks was so loud. We were so juiced with adrenaline. It took us forever to get back to sleep. And we were laughing about it the next morning with our friends, and they forgot to warn us because they don't even hear it anymore. They've heard it every night. They don't even hear it anymore, and they just forgot about it. And you can't imagine how they could forget, how they could not hear that. But it's called habituation. When you see or hear something so many times, you get so used to it that you stop noticing it. And I think that's what happens when we read these Christmas stories, like in Matthew chapter 2. If we really kind of heard it for the first time in some sense, really captured what the story is telling us, really kind of lived it as if we were there, it would be this great disturbance in the force, so to speak. It would be this adrenaline that, wow, if this is true, what does that mean for me? And which character am I in this story? And boy, I want to be that character, not that character. Let's pick it up in Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. Matthew says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, we'll talk about him in a minute, but that's a different King Herod than the one that Jesus stood before at his trial. This is the King Herod at his birth, his father or grandfather. Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? Now, we're not told who they asked. They're just asking people in the city. We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. So the Magi are in Jerusalem. They're asking people. Word's going to get to Herod that they're asking this question. But the question we have is, who are the Magi? Now, we have a Christmas carol that says, we three kings from Orient are. All that is wrong. They weren't kings. They were something different than that. They weren't from the Orient, and there certainly were more than three. They say three because of the three gifts, frankincense, gold, and myrrh, but they were a lot more than just three. The term Magi is a term that comes from the Persian and Babylonian Empire. It's a word for a sect of people who were priests of their religion. And their specialty was they interpreted dreams, they interpreted omens, they would interpret the stars, and from those interpretations, they would provide guidance to the outcome of events, particularly the birth of a king, the reign of a king, whether or not a battle would be successful. So they were highly sought after. They were highly respected and admired by people because the kings, like, for example, if you read Persian Fire, which is a history of the Persian Empire and the wars against Greece, author Tom Holland talks a lot in there about how the Magi's approval was sought after by the kings, by Cyrus, by Darius after him, that having the approval of the Magi saying, you are anointed, you should be king, they would crown them king, determine how long their reign is going to be, what battles they should fight, whether or not they would be successful. This is why Matthew gives minimal guidance of who they were, because he assumed his readers already knew. Alexander the Great, if you read a history of Alexander the Great, he had to deal with Magi a lot as he was conquering the Persian Empire. They were very well known, very mysterious, and highly respected and feared. It's where we get the word magic or magician, magi, magic. They were feared for their magic, which is why we'll see that Herod took them very seriously. He had a great level of respect to them. He doesn't harass them or threaten them in any kind of way. He treats them very gently because he takes their word as fact, and you don't mess with the Magi. So verse 3, Matthew says, when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. Now, we know a lot about this King Herod from history. Probably one of the more well-known people of this time. The King Herod, we know a lot about because he was appointed by the Roman Senate in 37 BC to be the vassal king over all of Palestine, which meant that Palestine was under his authority as king, and he was under Roman Empire authority as a vassal king. But he was also called Herod the Great. And he was called Herod the Great because he would have these incredible building projects and things like that. A well-known historian, Paul Johnson, says that in his 30 plus years of tyrannical reign over Palestine, he became the richest person in the entire Roman Empire. If you go to Israel today, most of the tourist sites that you see were the building projects of this King Herod. He built amphitheaters, he built aqueducts, he built all kinds of pools and altars to pagan gods, and he built all kinds of buildings that you would see there. The greatest example of his building project was the temple in Jerusalem. Even still to this day, even though it was destroyed by the Romans in 60-something, 70 AD, you can still see the wall, the temple wall there in Jerusalem. That was built by Herod the Great. And he was not just a great builder, but he was well known for his ruthlessness. So he killed his wife, murdered his wife. He killed his two sons. He killed his mother-in-law. A lot of jokes there I'm not gonna go into. He killed his brother-in-law, a lot of jokes there. He killed his uncle. He would kill hundreds of Jewish leaders. Anybody that he saw as a threat, he would kill them. Which is why Matthew says, let's look at it again. He says in verse 3, when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. Disturbed here is translated in a Greek word. It's probably a little soft. It could just as easily be translated, he was terrified, and all Jerusalem with him. See, here's the thing, and we don't know this from the text, but we know it from history. This is taking place in the last year of Herod's life. He's gonna die within a year of this story. Herod died in 4 BC. Now that's gonna cause some confusion here. I'll fix it in a minute. Most Bible scholars believe that Jesus was born in about 5 BC, give or take a half a year or so. 5 BC, now you're wondering, kind of an ontological puzzle, how could Christ be born before Christ? Well, here's the thing. In the conversion, the BC AD calendar confusion happened when the guy who was doing the calculations was converting from the Roman calendar to a Christian calendar. He got confused. He didn't have the date right when it came to Herod's death. And so he also forgot to account for the year 0. So there's a year missed there. So Jesus was born about 2,030 years ago, 29 years ago, even though we call it the year 2024. The calculation was off in 533 AD, and it's been off ever since. But here's the thing, is that Herod became, we know from history, more and more paranoid, more and more insecure, feeling more and more threatened the last years of his life. So the events that are happening here are happening in the last year of his life. He's going to die. Jesus is born. He's going to die this year. And he is hyper paranoid about things that are happening here. So verse 4 says, when he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. Again, he's taking the Magi's word as fact. They said that the King of the Jews has been born. They want to know where. So Herod's gonna find out where, because he wants to know too, because he is the most threatened at any point in his entire life by anybody who challenges his power. So he asked these chief priests, these Jewish scholars, Bible scholars, they're the experts in what we call the Old Testament. Hey, where is the Messiah supposed to be born? So here's the thing we get from this. Herod believed the Bible so much so that he wanted to know from the Bible experts where the Messiah was to be born. Here's their answer. In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied. And then they go to the prophecy in Micah 5:2, where the prophet says that he'll be born in Bethlehem. And the next verse, and at verse 7, it says that then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. So he takes their word so seriously that if they could just say what day did the star appear, so he can know what day was the Messiah born in Bethlehem. Bethlehem was just 5 miles southwest of Jerusalem. And so he can find out where he is and, well, as the next part of the chapter will say, try to kill him. So he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him. It sounds like the evil lion and the Lion King as he says that. The thing is that Herod was ruled by his own kingdom of self. Herod lived for the kingdom of self. It was a tyrannical kingdom. It's an anxious kingdom. The more he lived for the kingdom of self, the more anxious, the more insecure, the more fearful he got. He was afraid of losing his power. He was afraid of being forgotten. He was afraid of being an insignificant nobody. And so he built his kingdom of self. And the kingdom of self is what drove him to build these great buildings so that he would never be forgotten. It was his fear of losing insignificance that he built all these things, and he actually built more, according to historians, than any other person in that era in the Roman Empire. His fear driving him to build, his fear driving him to be ruthless because he was afraid of losing his power. He was afraid of being a nobody. And so he would lash out violently and kill anybody, even his own wife, even his own sons, if he thought they were a threat to his power. He was ruled by fear. Richest man in the world, the king of all Palestine, is ruled by fear. You ever feel like that? I mean, in a sense, we can all say in the same way, we can see some parallels in our own life. We're not going around killing people. We're not going around all that kind of stuff because we're afraid we're gonna lose our power, but we do kind of do that with our words. If we feel threatened, we lash out and we say things in kind of violent words, aggressive words that we know hurt people and serve our own interests in some way, and we do that, we feel bad afterwards. We ask for forgiveness afterwards, but sometimes things that are said can't be taken back, the toothpaste illustration we all know. But we do it because it's this kingdom of self that's being threatened. It's this sense that we're gonna be a nobody. We're gonna be insignificant. We fear being insignificant. So we hyper-sexualize our lives to try to be significant that way. Or we hyper-success our lives so that people see us as successful. It's all these things that we do kind of in the same way that Herod did. Herod's an example of the extreme, but we're kind of the example of the constant that seems to be typical in the human condition. We fear the future, and so we hoard our money rather than being generous. It's all these kinds of things that we're just like Herod. But then this story shows us something that I think shows the way free of the tyranny, the anxious tyranny and the insecurity of the kingdom of self. It's what the Magi do. Of all people, these pagan Magi, astrologers, magicians, sorcerers, here's what they do. It says in verse 9, after they had heard the king, they went on their way. They're going to Bethlehem. It's 5 miles southwest of Jerusalem. They're on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose, so in other words, the star they saw rising in the east before they made the journey, they're seeing the star again, and it went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was, the child being Jesus. By the way, he's a child now. This is not the manger scene. I don't want to ruin your little manger scene. It's fine. Keep your little wise men there. But they weren't there at the manger scene. They're coming to another place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. Let's read on. They saw it again. This is the star. On coming to the house, not a manger, and coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother, Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now in Babylon, Persia, these are all gifts that you would give to a king. The myrrh is a little tricky, but the gold and frankincense are things that were given to Alexander the Great when he entered into Babylon, things like that. That was a very royal thing. And then Matthew sums up the story, and having been warned in a dream not to go back, so God's directly talking to them now, not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Now the question is, what's this star? It's a weird star. It's rising in the east when they're in Persia. So in the morning, before the sun comes up, this star just appears in the sky, and it's got this weird aspect to it. And somehow, we don't quite know what it is. People have speculated things, but it's not worth going into here. That's another time. It's kind of interesting, but it's not for sure true, so I'm not going to do it here in a sermon. But in some way, they saw that star rising in the east before the sun, and a star can be anything. In that language, a star can be a planet, it can be a comet, it can be a meteor, it can be a star, but they saw something, and somehow they interpreted that as the King of the Jews has been born, the Messiah. And so they make a 550-mile journey. That was a journey that would take a month at least. Had to be a caravan. You wouldn't just have 3 people travel. They had a large journey. These are Magi. They're very powerful. Everybody gets out of their way, and they make a caravan to Jerusalem, 550 miles. The text seems to indicate the star's not there anymore. They're talking about a star they saw in the east when they're in Jerusalem. Now on their way to Bethlehem, they see the star in the southwest. Well, it could be a supernatural thing. That would fit the context, right, of Matthew. We've got angels, we've got a virgin giving birth. So there's a lot of supernatural things already, so no big struggle there to think that God's gonna put some star in the sky that guides the Magi. But I think it could also be a comet. A comet would fit this description, according to at least stuff I've read, books I've read, and things like that. And I'll do this really quick, but I think it's interesting. And that is that what would operate like this, where it would stop over a house and all that kind of stuff. Here you have a comet where a comet is a big rock. It can be like 2 miles big, or it can be, a lot more miles than that in diameter. And it's just a big rock of dirt, dust, ice. And a comet always orbits around the sun, not so much like a circle, but more like a torpedo kind of thing. It does this kind of an orbit around the sun. And as it comes to the sun, let's say the sun's right here, just keep that there in your head. As the comet comes to the sun, it is gonna melt the ice. Then the ice has become gas, and the gas is pushed away by the sun's radiation from the comet, and the sun's light lights up the gas as it's pushed away. And it's not fire from the comet, it's just gas lit up by the sun, and that's why the comet has a tail. And as a comet gets closer to the sun, that tail becomes longer, larger. And the tail is always going away from the sun. So the comet goes around the sun. If the sun's here, the tail is always going the opposite way of the sun. So they see it in the east, they see it before the comet comes around the sun. It's in the morning sky. But then as it goes behind the sun, they don't see it anymore. They get to Jerusalem, and they're going now from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, and now this comet is going to be in the southwest sky. And it's got this tail, and if they're coming at the point where it's the closest to the sun, but they can see it right before sunset, right after sunset, I should say, just right after sunset, that tail's gonna be long. And so it would look like this picture here. This was the comet that we saw this fall. You didn't see this because somebody took this when it was closest to the sun, right after the sun set. And so you see the sun is melting the gases. They're going away from the comet. The sun's light is lighting up the comet, but it would look like it's pinpointing a house. Now, all this to say, boy, weren't they fortunate that it just so happened to be a comet? What I'm trying to say is if it was a comet, billions of years ago, God had put this comet into orbit so that right at the exact time it would act in such a way that it would catch the eye of the Magi, and the Magi would make their journey, cause all this commotion in Jerusalem with Herod that the rest of the chapter is going to be about, and the Magi would be directed right to the very house where they see Jesus. And there's something about that phrase, when they saw Jesus, they bowed down before him and they worshiped him. And they opened up their treasure and they presented him with gifts. There's just something about that picture. If we could just be in it for a minute and just imagine these Magi that everybody respected, everybody feared. Kings needed their approval to be king. If they didn't have their approval, the people wouldn't trust the king. They've made a 550-mile trip to Bethlehem, and they're at the feet of Jesus. They're at Jesus, the child. He's probably less than a year old. And they're bowing before him and worshiping him. And they're presenting him with the royal gifts that they would give any true king. And there's a picture there. I just wonder if that's something you've done. Have you ever bowed? I mean, literally with your body, but I'm not gonna embarrass you. We're not gonna ask you to do it here, don't get nervous. But have you literally bowed with your body to Jesus to worship him? And there's something about that picture of opening up their treasure and giving their treasure to Jesus. It's a picture of when we really worship Jesus as the Messiah, we bow to him, we submit to his authority, and we give our whole lives to him. The reason why we wouldn't give our whole lives to him, the reason why we wouldn't bow to him is the same reason Herod wouldn't. And that's somehow we're being fooled by the kingdom of self. Somehow we're being fooled by thinking our fears have to be followed, our insecurities have to be listened to, our anxieties are indicative of our future, and we trust in those, we fear those, and we let those things manipulate our lives. We all do it. We all know what it's like to have it done to us. But there's a better way. There's a way that says what the Bible says, perfect love casts out all fear. That there's this sense where we learn to worship, we bow before Jesus, and we give him our fears. We give him our anxieties about the future. We give him our fear of being insignificant, of being powerless. And we just give it to him, and we trust his promise that in him we truly will have power in the resurrection. We will have glory and significance in the resurrection, that he has our best future in mind, and that his will is always in our best interest. And there's this act of worship that comes when we bow before him. That's why there's something about communion, and it's weird because communion is something that churches have been doing ever since Jesus did it first with his disciples. There's this thing where we're doing something that churches have been doing for 2,000 years almost. Jesus did it that first night. He gave them a sign. He took the bread that was at the Passover meal and he said, this is the sign. This is my body given for you. He took the wine at the meal and he said, this is the blood of my promise, the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. We don't have wine in our church. It's all a fraud. It's poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. And Jesus took the wine and he poured it out. But it was meant to be a sign. This is not magic. It's a sign. Just like the star to the Magi. This is where you can let go of your fears of the kingdom of self, that drive your kingdom of self. This is where you can let go of your fears of the future, let go of being powerless, let go of being insignificant, nobody, and you can trust that only in Jesus will you become all those things, powerful, somebody, significant, and a future that will never end. So if you believe those things and you want to come forward, you would just come forward. There'll be people up here and there'll be a goblet in their hand and that's got wine in it. The one on the stool has juice. If you want the gluten-free or juice options and you want to do it that way, you can grab one of those. Or otherwise you would take a piece of bread and break it and dip it in either the wine or the juice. But as you come, let this story guide your imagery. this is you coming before Jesus and you're bowing before him to worship him and to open your treasure and to give your life to him. Those who are gonna serve communion, if you would come forward to serve communion, to get ready, and I'll pray. God, we thank you for this sign that you first did with your disciples in that room before you were crucified. And disciples have been doing it ever since. That's why we do it today. It began that night. It continues here today. And it will be done until you return and fulfill your promise. We thank you for this sign in Jesus' name. Amen.